Okay, so let's move on to actual things, to actual code. Okay, so so I'm gonna go to this notebook and I'm gonna quickly go through this because time is not. I want to get through to cross validation. Okay, so introduction to Scikit-Learn. So the steps that I talked about before, like having the idea of having features, of having outcomes, of having models that you want to propose and you want to use data to fit, all of those concepts fit into the package Scikit-Learn. And Scikit-Learn is basically a package for machine learning in Python. It's not so much about statistical analysis, but it's more about, machine learning in which you care about evaluating the performance of the methods, but not, it doesn't have like statistical tests and things like that. So it's a little poor on that side. Now I have some toy examples here. So I have the data sets of flowers, and here I have a, and by the way, I took this from the book from Jake. But I think it is nicely explained how Scikit-Learn works. So most of the methods in Scikit-Learn are supervised learning, but it has some unsupervised. So, but I will take a look at both here. Let's quickly go through them. So most of them are going to receive a matrix of numbers. Okay, so similar to what we saw in the kind of theory slides where you have a matrix. The rows are the samples and the columns are the features. So if we are with my toy example, if we are predicting citations, we'll have 3 columns where we have, the ranking of the journal, the ranking of the author, and the ranking of the institution, and the target vector will be the citation in 2 years. Okay, so you want to have for Scikit-Learn 2 NumPy arrays to represent this. Okay. Now, sometimes, and for the little homework, I don't know what to call it, but the little exercise that we'll do after the break, we don't have the features in NumPy array format. So we will look at text analysis. So what we have to do something called feature engineering to transform text into numbers, and then we can pass them through the traditional analysis. And all right, so the idea of Scikit-Learn is very, very simple. You have different sub-packages, sub-models, sub-modules that allow you to fit classification, regression, supervised, unsupervised learning problems, and allows you to compute the errors that you're making. What is the, let's say, the average the average square error, and it also allows you to evaluate your models. But we'll see that in the next session where you kind of compare models with different performances. Okay, so I'm gonna import here. So I have clustering, I have model selection. It also has some toy data sets, unsupervised learning, feature engineering, and selection. So I'm gonna create a fake data set here, which is a very basic kind of regression. We have X and we have some noise, and we want to learn a regression here. Okay, so to do that is very simple. Okay, so I'm going to import from linear models, from the linear model module, the linear regression class, and the way that it will work, and all of the methods in Scikit-Learn work the same way. Okay, I will first define the model. I will say, I'm going to define my little model. It has these 3 parameters that I want to find based on the data. And here, when I define the model, I can provide several parameters. Okay, so if I press, I'm going to execute this so that I have it. If I press Shift Enter, you can see all the parameters available. So fit intercept, it will assume an intercept, and you should always do that unless you normalize the data somehow. and this will just apply the standard way of finding the parameters. And it's very, very simple. And you can see now there are other more sophisticated kinds of regressions with regularizations. We won't get into that here. This is just the vanilla regression. So I'm going to define the model. And I have my features, okay? So these are the features that represent this. So it's just one feature, which is the x-axis, and I put it in this command here, just makes it into a matrix where I only have one column, and then I have what I want to try to predict, and all the methods work the same. I have the model, I define it, and then I fit the data. Okay. It's Shift Tab someone is asking, how did I make it to show the help? You have to press Shift Tab. You have to be inside the parentheses, and it will show you that. Now, if you press it multiple times, there will be multiple, it will cycle through multiple things. So first it will show it like this. The second time it will show it like that. The third time it will show it like that. And the fourth time it will show it below. It's a little silly, but that's how it works. All right, so if I fit the data, it will fit this data here, so the features, and it will try to relate the features with the outcomes. Okay, so I'll run that very, very fast. And then I can access, when it fits, it will have the parameters learned inside. And depending on the method that you are using, you will have different ways of accessing those parameters. Okay, so here in linear regression, at least, coef means the parameter of your regression. So basically, I'm gonna kind of on the fly here we are creating a method where you have an intercept, you have the weight of, in this case, x. So you are estimating B1 that is related to, this is the coefficient of the feature. So this is related, this is the coefficient of only one feature. So that's B1. And then to access the intercept, you have to use a different object inside the model. Okay. So at the end, the model will be, minus 0.09 plus 1.9. Now, what's cool about this is I can make predictions. I can tell the model and I can predict. And I can pass here, one data point, let's say 8. Okay, so if I put 8 here, hopefully it will predict something like 15 if my eye is not confusing me. So if I put 8 as input, it should predict 15. Let's see if that works. So I'm going to pass 8, and it predicts 14.9. I was pretty close. Eyeballing always works. Now you can run other kinds of analysis like classification. So, but when you do analysis of real data sets, you want to do cross-validation. So you want to train on a data set, but you want to see how well it does on data that you have never seen before. Okay, so there is some functionality for doing that splitting. You can pass the data to this function test, a train test split, and it split the data randomly into pieces. And I'm going to apply a method that is not regression. It's not logistic regression for classification. It's naive Bayes. I fit it to the training data, and I'm predicting the testing data. And then Scikit-Learn has this way of computing the accuracy, and it has many other measures of performance. Okay, so again, if I press Shift Tab, you can see all the ways that you can measure performance. Score, you can pass many things. You have unsupervised learning too. So PCA is one of the most common ones. It's a linear decomposition of the features. So see, Iris has how many features? Has 4 features, and we want to display it. So we want to map those 4 features into 2 features so that we can plot it on a plot. And as you can see, it's kind of separating they found that one dimension should separate them very well, but the other dimension doesn't help too much in separating them. So we can do clustering. So this does the clustering, mixture models, which is kind of k-means and it did a pretty good job. So there is here some noise. So even this is completely unsupervised, and it was able to discover that there are these 3 clusters. And I think we cluster all the features, but then when we plot them in the PCA space, sorry. Okay, handwritten numbers. You probably are familiar with this example. This code will display, well, I guess it was already displaying it, but this is a very nice plot to show. So you're probably familiar with this. So I have an image, basically. I have a 8x8 grayscale image, and I want to, then I have the label of it. So I want to take, based on a small picture, I want to estimate, predict, classify the number that it contains. So fit reg, where is that fit reg? I don't know if you're talking to me, Sylvia, but I didn't.
Yes, I was. It's in the.
Oh, fit reg. Yeah, I don't know.
Oh.
I think it tries to show a regression based. I mean, I'm just making stuff up, but here it seems that it's a linear model and it's plotting it. So if I say true, it will try to fit lines to this. Yeah, so I tried to fit line, but we didn't want to do that. So, okay, so we want to classify these. So I will, well, with this, you can plot them too. So I'm going to use a more sophisticated way of doing unsupervised learning with isomap. And it does a pretty good job at separating the different classes into space. So isomap, we won't look into it here in this summer school, but it's a very expensive operation. So if your data set is big, in this case, it's just 1800. But if it's big, it might be too much for it. But it does a pretty good job of separating the characters. So you have to think about that this is A by A, so you have 64 real numbers, basically, that are the grayscale values of the pixel. And somehow it's able to make sense of that and project them into a 2-dimensional space. So it's a pretty nice way of representing the numbers. So we can classify them with naive Bayes, and we can, let's see, unknown label. Okay, what's going on? Okay, why, let's see. Let's do this again. Okay, so I think somewhere in here, there's some code that is overriding things. So, or I messed up somehow. Okay, so I redid it, and I split it, and then I applied Gaussian naive Bayes, and I will compute the accuracy, and I have 83% accuracy. I can also look at the confusion matrix, and you can see that, let's say, there are some 2s that is confusing with 8 for some reason, but for the most part, is making the correct predictions for the numbers. All right, so your task, the activity, should be relatively simple. The cool thing and the coolest thing about Scikit-Learn is that they have these awesome websites where you can just go crazy, visit it, try all kinds of things. So you have supervised learning. They have all kinds of methods. Now they don't have deep learning. They don't have kind of more, these are more standard traditional machine learning methods. Okay, so deep learning, there is an entire package dedicated to that, and we'll look at it on Thursday. But it has some pretty, and it's relatively fast. So Scikit-Learn is really, really fast for fitting the models. So your activity will be to go to the website, and you will look for these methods. Okay. Now the cool thing is that you don't need to worry about what this method is, because you know that each object in Scikit-Learn will have the same structure. You will define the model like this. You define the model like this, and then you fit it to the data. So it's basically almost the same as this, and it will work. Okay, so you don't need to worry about much. And then you will apply to this digits data, and you will estimate the error of your classification. Hopefully, spoiler alert, this method is relatively newer than naive Bayes, so it should be more accurate, hopefully. So the accuracy of naive Bayes is 83%. The accuracy of convolutional neural networks, which is the state of the art for this problem, I think is around 96%. So it's pretty good. All right, so let's break out again and do this activity. Any questions? All right, so we are back. And the question is, was it better or was it worse? Gradient boosting regression, better. How much better? I think I'm 95%, wow. Amazing, right? What do you think about the interpretability of this? Better those 7s who were predicted as 2 disappear. Ah, cool. So this is Gaussian naive Bayes. So this is very, very simple. The 8, right? 2 predicted it as 8, right? Now this is very gradient boosted trees. We won't see them in this summer school, but basically you can think of them as it's an ensemble methods. Yes, that's correct. It's a method that is based on boosting. The idea is that you take a very simple classifier as a base model, you fit it to the data, you see the errors that it makes, and then you ask this next classifier, also very simple, to fix those errors, and then you keep repeating that process. It's a very beautiful idea. So, you at the end you have a combination, a sequential set of classifiers where each of them is correcting the errors of the previous classifier. So Sylvia asked if this is like random forest. It is like random forest in the sense that it's combining several classifiers. The difference, though, is that boosting is fixing the, let's say the jth tree is fixing the mistakes of the j-1 tree. Okay, so they have a heavy, heavy dependency among the trees. Random forest, each of the trees is independent, but each of the trees was trained on different samples of the data. So, I mean, different samples and different features of the data. So, and they can, so random forest can be, it's a little easier to parallelize because you can just distribute the data and fit separately, but gradient boosting is a little harder. I think the book, The Elements of Statistical Learning, has those. It's called Ensemble Methods, and it has a section on that. And I recommend it in the first lecture that I gave, I mean, not the first lecture, the first presentation that I gave today in the morning, I talk about those books and other resources. All right, so I don't have the solution, but it looks like you guys did it. So I'm gonna upload perhaps the solution here later. Okay. Now there is a reason. Oh, that's the solution. Thank you. Right. Perfect. Now there is a reason why we're seeing what we're seeing. Like there is a reason why a more complicated model is showing the performance that it's showing, and we will try to. Hold on, this is not what I want. We'll try to understand that also from a statistical perspective, why this is happening. All right, so and the way that we'll try to think about this is to think about what happens when we try to generalize the performance of our model. Okay, so how can we think about the predictions and the errors that will make our classifier in the future for data that it has never seen? We cannot perfectly reproduce that process in the lab, but we can try by applying clever splitting of the data and clever validation. And you already got a taste of that when you split it into training and validation, but there are other ways of doing it. Now, the reason why an naive-Bayes had worse performance is because naive-Bayes is basically a very simple classifier. So based on the stuff that we'll see in this section, you will be able to tell whether your classifier is not extracting all the information that you might have in your data. So in a sense, naive-Bayes, we can say that it was underfitting the data. Okay, so we hear a lot about overfitting, but underfitting is also something that happens. All right. So from the previous unit, we saw, okay, we have our function that we are trying to learn. We propose a model, it could be a linear model, a more complicated model. We'll use the data to learn the parameters of that model. We'll make predictions and we'll measure the performance of that. However, to think about what will happen in the future, we have to think about what is the generalization performance of our model. And most of us, I mean, everybody is interested in what would happen in the future, right? So if you are proposing a model in science of science about a phenomenon, you are interested in generalizing from your data, right? Unless you maybe in history, you might not, that might not be such a powerful incentive, but you still want to generalize what happened, you know, a couple hundred years ago to what's happening today, for example. So there is still a sense of generalizability. And we'll use a very simple, not simple, but I guess a very common way of trying to estimate that parts, the generalization performance. That's called cross-validation. And we'll take a look at something called the bias variance decomposition. And this to me is one of the most important concepts in machine learning because it allows you to understand why we overfit, why we underfit, what's happening. And then we'll take a look at ways of thinking about performance for classifiers. Okay, so far we have only seen, well, I guess with the digit example, we saw classifiers and we saw accuracy, but accuracy is not that great as a measure of performance. We prefer to use something different like ROC curve or the area under the ROC curve. We'll look at that. Okay, generalization performance. Now, one of my favorite examples of generalization is this paper by Josh Tenenbaum. He's a psychologist, and he's been interested for a long time in one-shot learning. Like, how can humans, based on just one instance of something that never seen before, how they are able to transfer that into a new environment? So, and they have this task for many, many years ago where they ask people, they present these foreign objects, and they ask, well, first they tell people, okay, imagine that these are tufas, okay? So they just give people just 3 instances of whatever this is. Tufa is a new word. And then they ask the subjects whether the other things are tufas. So they point to something. So I hope you can see my mouse. So if I point to this object, I would assume, why don't you type in the chat? Okay, do you think this is a tufa? The one that I'm hovering over? No, right? What about this? Maybe, could be. What about this? Excellent. So you can immediately see how you were able to imagine this is an image, so it's thousands of pixels, but somehow your brain has this way of extracting meaning and structure, and just took 3 data points and it was able to generalize. And you already have a sense of uncertainty. You were pretty sure that this was not a tufa. You were not so sure about, I forget which one I pointed to, I think it was this one, but you were definitely sure about this one. So somehow you were able to classify them with really little training. So that's really impressive. So we want machines to do the same. How can we think about this issue? Now, another most important ideas in machine learning and in learning in general is this paper by David Wolper from the Santa Fe Institute, where he showed that there is no single method that can dominate all data sets. Okay, so there is no way that I can teach you, deep learning or random forest, and you can go happy about your life for the rest of humanity, because that method will not work in all data sets. So he showed that in his beautiful paper. And in a way, it's like a intuitive solution. Of course, there are data sets that you've never seen, and your algorithm will not be adapted to that data set. So, but this just shows you that you need to try different things with your data. There is no one solution that fits all. And this is what I take out from this paper. All right, so let's take a look. So we will start by saying, okay, let's define a loss function, whatever that is. It could be a mean square error, just the difference between the real data and our prediction, and we square that. It could be accuracy. It could be the log likelihood of a model. It could be many, many things, okay? But we'll have a loss function, and we want to think about how the loss function generalizes, okay? So what we want is, given a data set, a training data set that is fixed, we want to see how the loss function will generalize to other data sets, okay? That's what we should have in mind. We'll have a data set about papers, about whatever you are trying to understand, and we want to see how we will do in the future for all possible data sets, given the training data that we have, okay? That will be the ideal scenario, but that's really, really hard, because we basically will need to require to have infinite amounts of data, or data that we didn't see during training. And we are fixing it. So basically we're saying, okay, don't touch this data. This is the results that I'm reporting are just based on this training data. And I will take data from somewhere else to measure the performance. And this is really expensive, because you basically need to throw away the data that you didn't use during your training to just estimate the performance. So there are these methods that allow you to train your method, your model, and reuse your training data in different folds. And I'll show you what that means. So basically you will, sometimes you will use a part of the data as you're training, another part as testing, and then you will flip it. And in that way you will reuse as much of the data as possible. Okay, so these are other examples of performance measures. Okay, so now this idea, this general idea that I'm showing you on the screen, where you have three sets, subset of the data to assess the performance of your model, it's a generalization of what we saw before in the notebook. So when you executed a notebook with Scikit-Learn, we split the data into two sets. Okay, you had a training set, so you took naive Bayes and you're training there, and then you predicted the test set and you measure the performance. Sometimes, however, you want to compare models. So you have several hypotheses about something that might explain the data. So you might say, okay, I'm gonna try this regression with these features, but maybe I want to also try this more complicated model with all these non-linearities, and I just want to see which one is better. To do that, you need actually another split, and that's called the test split, because you need to first use the training split as a way of finding the parameter for the specific model that you are analyzing. Let's say you have a linear regression and you have three parameters, and you want to find those parameters based on the training split. But then when you compare different models, you might be comparing models that have different complexities. Okay, so by definition, models that have more complexity will have better training performance. Okay, so because they're able to fit the data much more nicely, they have more degrees of freedom. So you want to control for the complexity of the models by using a validation set, by seeing how well it will generalize in the future. Then after you estimate that validation performance, you will pick the best model. You will say, okay, the regression with 2 variables is actually better than the regression with 10 variables because it was able to generalize better. It didn't fit, it didn't overfit. Now, after you pick that, you have to report the performance again in a generalized sense. So you have to pick a different split of the data and report there, because you want basically to report the data on the performance on data that your model had never seen. Now, if you're a if you're a data scientist or you like to play around with things, I will recommend that you play on a website called Kaggle. Type in there, where it's basically like a stock, we're not in a stock market, but basically you have people competing to make the best predictions or the most interpretable predictions for certain problems. And this idea of splitting the data is very clear there, because a company, let's say, releases a data set on lung scans, X-rays, let's say lung X-rays, and they want you to create a model, let's say, to detect COVID-19 or something else. Okay, so they give you training data, you test on that, and then you submit your predictions for a validation set. Okay, and then you have a scoreboard where they list you. But because that biases the performance, because they will always pick the best one, they want to make sure that the people haven't adapted to the I lost it. What was I gonna say? To the ranking, right? They don't want people to be optimizing the ranking. Okay, so they have a different set of data that nobody has ever seen, and that's the test split, and they call it sometimes the private data, and that's how they choose the winner. Okay, so now the simplest way of doing this is to split the data into 3 parts when you start your analysis: the training, validation, testing. So I suggest this is a signature split that I do, but the problem with this split of using 60% for training, 30% for validation, 10% for testing, is that you're only using 60% in reality of your data. So you're throwing away 40% that could give you information about what the best method is. So it's not the greatest, but it's really fast, it's really simple. The most standard way of doing it is something called cross-validation, where you repeat the following process. You have your training data and you split it. Okay, so you create, you basically, you randomize it first, and then you create these folds. So let's say you have 10 folds. So you split your data into 10 pieces, and you take one piece in one iteration, and you use the rest for training. So you use the rest for training and validation. And then you use the leftover as testing, and you repeat that process over and over again. So at the end of all the iterations, you will see that you will have used all the data. So it's a beautiful solution. There are some problems, some limitations, because there is some correlation, but it's a great way of doing it. Now when you optimize a method and you try to fit it to the data, the method doesn't need to be, the way that you measure the performance of the method doesn't need to coincide with the way that you train it. That's not so clear here with this example, but let's say sometimes you use something called regularization. So you train your model, but then you penalize it when it uses too many parameters. Okay, so I won't get into the details of that, but basically you kind of modify the training schedule so that you try to boost the generalizability of the model. All right. So this is the equation that it's very important to understand. So we will try to think about yes, so you find you have 10 distributions of testing, and then you kind of take the average of that, and that's the performance on testing. That's what you claim your method does. That's a question from the audience. So we will think about the generalization performance of different models. Okay, and the way that we will do it is very similar to what we did a couple of hours ago when we estimated that in your performance measure, you have irreducible error and you have reducible error. Okay, so you will always have the irreducible error, sadly. But if you keep developing the equation, you will find that you will have two things. Okay, so you will reduce this square error, and this is for a square error, but the same idea applies to other ways of measuring performance. You will find that the reducible error can be further decomposed into two things. And I will try to convey what they mean. One component is called the bias, although it's more like bias square because the bias could be positive or negative. And this means on average, if you take all the models that you fit to the data, and I will show you later because you have to imagine that this is a distribution, so you will see samples of data over time. If you take the average fits of your model and you compare it to the true function, you want to see how much you deviate from that. That's called the bias. So the more bias you have, the more means that your method is biased in the sense that it won't adapt to the data set that you are showing it. So it has some sort of pre-defined idea of where it should go. It doesn't try to approximate the true function. So that's the bias. The second component is the variance. How much your method changes from fit to fit. Okay, so if you look at all the samples of data and you fit your method to those samples, you want to see how much each of the fits compares with the average fit. So this is the variance. All right, so let's see if we can make sense of that. So this is a fundamental decomposition, and in the sense that it appears everywhere. But the most important thing is that usually methods that have high variance have low bias, and methods that have high bias have low variance, and we'll see why that happens. So I have this example here. It's a for some reason. Let's see. Hopefully, I can zoom out. Okay, great. So I'm showing just the bias variance decomposition here in the equation, the same as before. And I'm doing a simulation so that we can understand what's going on. And the simulation is as follows. I'm going to assume that the true function governing the data that I see is the following. It's 5 times x to minus 2. So that's the blue line here. That's the true function that we're trying to estimate. What we observe, however, is a noisy version of that because we have some noise that we cannot get rid of in the system. And that's going to appear here. That's the reducible noise. It doesn't matter how clever we get, we will always have some noise in the system. Now, to try to understand the bias variance decomposition, it's good to understand that the data that you see is not the data that you will see in the future. So you have to think about what will happen if you were to observe data sets of the same size an infinite number of times. So that's why it's important to think about this frequencies view from probability. What will happen if you observe this thing an infinite number of times of the same size? And here I'm showing you 9 different samples of that process that I showed you before, okay? The function is the same. The true function is exactly the same. Hopefully that's big enough. The true function is exactly the same, but every time for each of the panel, it's a slightly different data set. You see, like here you have a cluster, then you have something here. So each of these things is different. So you have to think about what will happen with the method you provide, what happens and how it fits each of the samples. And then you can reason about this expression here based on that idea, this here. So let's assume that we have a regression, okay? I'm gonna assume that my model is the following. It has an intercept and it has a weight. And I will see how it fits each of the samples, okay? So these are each of the samples from before. let's see if this works. Does this work? It doesn't look too nice. Is it zooming in? Can you guys let me know? It's like a little window with a zoom, no? Okay. Okay, never mind. So these are the different samples. These are different data sets, and you can see it there. And you can see that the linear function is changing a little bit. I don't know if you can see it, but here is a little higher than this one, at least this side. Yeah, it's not changing a lot. I mean, you can see that here, this one is very close to the line, right? Here is very, very close to the line. But here is very far away, at least in this part. Okay, so the function for different samples of the data is changing, the function that you're learning. Okay, so the red line is the f hat here, and the blue line is the f. Okay. Is the f. So the bias is this one. The bias is on average, if you take the average of all your red functions, how close are you going to get to the blue line? Okay, that's the question. This is what this is measuring. If I take the average of the red line, how close I'm going to get to the blue line? And as you can see, well, it's even though I can observe, data, I still will have some bias. I will tend to have this little difference here that might be hard to get rid of. In fact, it might be impossible to get rid of. So linear regression in general have high bias for this reason, because even though we're showing a different data set, it's too simple, at least in this case, to fit this function. Now I will try a different method. I will try a method called nearest neighbor. It's a very, very simple method. And the idea is that to make a prediction, I will look at the points that are surrounding in that area of the space, and I will make a prediction that is the average of the k closest points in my training data. Okay, so let's say here for this green point, to make a prediction in this green point, I will take the average of the surrounding points around it. That expectation, it's not the expectation of an expectation, because the expectation of an expectation is just the expectation. This is the expectation of how the function moves around the expectation of that function. That's the more accurate description. So when k is 1, okay, for nearest neighbor, the function will fit really, really well to the training data, because every time we move, it will just find the closest point. So it will be really wiggly, as you can see, right? I hope you can see that it's kind of fitting everything, every nook and cranny really, really well. Now, if I increase the k, so if instead of taking a look at the closest neighbor, just one neighbor, if I take a look at more neighbors, you will see that it will take the average across a larger neighborhood. So it will be not so wiggly. So this is 20 neighbors. Okay, so here it took the average of 20 neighbors. And as you can see, it's adapting very well. Now, if I go back to K1, and I think about the bias component, you can see that if I take the average, this here means if I take the average of the difference of my red curve and the blue curve, if I take the average, on average, it's going to be very, very close to the blue line, because it just adapts very, very well to the data. So it will have a very, very low bias. Sorry that I cannot, for some reason, not show. Okay, here. So it's going to have a very, very low bias, because on average, I'm going to approximate the blue line, the blue curve really well. The problem is that every time the variance, this is the variance part, every time I fit the data, the function will change a lot. And this is what the variance is showing. The variance will be really, really high, because for every sample of the data, the function will just be completely different. And you can see it here. If I compare this to linear regression, it's the opposite. Every time I fit, it will be relatively similar. Okay, so if I compute the variance of the red line, which is my f hat here, the variance of regression is really low because it won't change much from regression to regression for different data sets. And that's the idea of bias variance trade-off. Because for some kinds of problems, sometimes you have too much bias. And for other kinds of problems, sometimes you have too little bias. In this case, for this particular example of this blue line, the regression has too much bias because it doesn't adapt too well to the actual underlying trend. Okay, and it has too little variance conversely. So it's basically almost the two sides of the same coin. On the other hand, if I do the nearest neighbor with just one neighbor, it will adapt too well to the data point. So it will have, I mean, you can see that this is clearly not correct. It's just doing too much moving around, okay? So k nearest neighbor with just one neighbor has too much variance, okay? So the error will be too big because it just varies too much. So if I take this expectation, this value will be huge, the variance here. Unfortunately, it's covered. The bias will be really tiny because I will approximate on average very close to the blue line, but on average, the variance will be just too high, okay? So your goal, and to kind of summarize why I'm showing you this, is your goal is to think about parameters that change the complexity of your model so that you match the complexity of the data. And the way that people think about this, so here I'm showing them some side by side, and this is clearly a better fit, although it's making a huge mistake here. Maybe it's not so clear now. Yes, exactly. So it relates very close to overfit, and that's my next slide. Excellent question, therefore. So I'm going to skip this just to show you that slide, okay? So if you have a parameter that controls the model complexity, so in k nearest neighbor is the number of neighbors, in regression is the number of terms that you have, and so on and so forth, you can control the complexity of your model, okay? So if the model is not too complex, in the case of nearest neighbor, that will mean too many neighbors, then you will have high bias and low variance. So here I'm showing you the bias square because it has to be positive, and I have the variance, okay? So as I increase the complexity of the model, in the case, again, of neighbors, if I decrease the number of neighbors, I will reduce the bias, but I will increase the variance. In the case of regression, to increase the complexity, I need to add terms to the regression. So I will reduce the bias, but I will increase the variance. What will happen, however, is what we observe when we fit the data, we observe just this line, okay, the green line. We don't get to observe, or it's relatively hard to observe, the bias and variance, but we have to be aware that there is a point at which the complexity of the model matches the complexity of the underlying trends in the data. Generally, and this is to Bilal's question, when you have too much, when you see something like this, when the performance is really good and you reduce the complexity of the model and it starts to increase, it starts to decrease the performance, so you get more error, that means that you're underfitting. Conversely, if you increase the complexity and the performance decreases, that's a sign of overfitting. All right. Now, this happens, usually the way that this is shown is with these plots where you have the mean square error, but the same happens with other ways of measuring errors. Sometimes in regression, you use something called R-square, and the same thing happens. I did a little experiment here. So this is the R-square, the variance explained, and you can see that there is a sweet spot. This is for example data set. I think you can see it. It's behind this cell. So random forest is someone asked about it, and it's a nice way of measuring. It's a very, it has a lot of variance, but somehow it tries to control variance automatically because it does like an inline check. Okay, another very useful curve when you're fitting models is to compare the different models and see how they progress as you increase the data size. Okay, so this is not too big. But here I'm showing you the R square. So the R square, the higher, the better. And I'm showing how the performance of the model increases as I increase the data size. You can see the regression. And this is, I think, this is predicting the citations, by the way. So as you can see, regression just gets stuck. We can give it more data, but it's biased. Okay, so it doesn't, it kind of stuck in a certain way of understanding the data. So it doesn't have enough mileage degrees of freedom to fit the complexity of the data. A model that is a little bit more complex is polynomial regression, where I add the squares, the cubes, the fourth of the features, and it's able to start much higher the performance with smaller data set, but it also gets stuck. If I try something like random forest, however, at the beginning, the performance is actually worse than the other two because it doesn't have enough data. It's overfitting here. But as I added more data, you will see that it will have enough degrees of freedom to match the complexity of the data, and it will actually be a better trade-off between bias and variance. Okay, so I will, in these slides, I'll talk about how to measure performance for classifications. But I will leave this for you to take a look at. And this is for binary classification. So you have a confusion matrix and you have these specific names for the different cases that you will get. And you measure the performance differently. Now with R square or MSE, you measure it with F1, with other ways of doing it. So I wanted to move now on to how to do this cross-validation business with Scikit-Learn. Okay. So here I have the code for loading. So I have the articles feature. So I have the author rank, the affiliation, the journal rank, and the citation count. So I'm only looking at papers that have less than 200 citations. And I'm adding a column called highly cited. Okay, so this will be highly cited if it has more than 50 citations. Okay, so I want to take these features and predict the citation. So that will be the regression, or predict whether it will be highly cited or not. By the way, if you're a fan of ggplot, is this working or not? What's going on? Not sure if this is working. There is a package called plot9 that tries to reproduce a lot of ggplot. So I'm plotting data, blah, blah, blah. And here I have code for running the regression. So I'm going to skip this. I wanted to show you this. Okay, so this is the code for comparing the different models. Okay, this will reproduce that. And there is this little function that helps you with that. It's called learning curve. This is from Scikit-Learn. I will automatically take a model and I will see how it evolves as you increase the size of the data. All right, so I wanted to get to here because it's part of the activity. All right. So you have your data. You have the data that I was showing you before. Let's say you want to compare different models. Okay, I want to see which one of these is the best. Maybe one just has too much bias. Maybe one has just too much variance. So I want to understand what's going on. So I'm going to compare, in this case, 3 different models. I will load this. Excellent. I need to execute this. I hope. Maybe I need to execute something else. Let me see. Here. Okay, so I need to execute that. Okay, so I define my 3 models, and I will now put them side by side. Yeah, I love Plot9 for plotting. So I'll put them side by side. I will compare them, but I have to do it properly. Remember, I'm comparing models of different complexity, and this is something that people messed up a lot. You need 3 splits to do this. Okay, so what I will do, I will first look at the data. So my data is as follows. So it has, oh, sorry, I have to load it. So where is, let me see, sorry about this. X, okay, here I have the rank. So I have X and Y. So I have X is my feature. So I have 79,000 papers, and I want to take only the first 1,000 to do my training and testing. Oh, I will only do it on 1,000 papers. Sorry. Okay, so I will do this. I will do I see. Okay. So, okay, this is how you should do it. You take your data and you split it into training and testing. These testing splits you never use, ever. Don't touch it, don't look at it, nothing. And then you fit the data to the training. One of the models is significantly more complex, but you can see that it's much better. So this is the score, and I believe it's doing R square. Is that possible? That looks too high. Oh, it's because I'm looking at the performance on training, so it doesn't make sense. This is a big no-no in machine learning. Don't train your model on training data and then predict on training data. So this is like meaningless. So what I have to do instead, I have to cross-validate on the training data, okay? And cross-val will do what we want, which is to split into different pieces and then validate on a piece that wasn't used during training. So this will do everything that we need. And as you can see, the R square is much more realistic. As you can see, the model that is simplest, which is the regression, wins. Okay, so remember that we have to use cross-validation to evaluate the performance of the model, to choose the models. Even though random forest? Random forest has amazing performance in training. That's obvious because it's much more complex. But in validation, here's where you see where they're really generalizing. And then if I want to report the performance, I have to run the performance of testing. All right, so why don't you, let's do this activity where you will do this with, you will compare 2 models. You will put your least regression and random forest classifier on AUC. And just to help you, because it seems that you need to execute this entire thing to get the data that you want, I believe. Or maybe this does it. So XY, I think this does it. Yeah, with this you get the data you need. So you need to split the data, and then the training, and then cross-validate. Okay. So it's a matter of just taking this code and looking in Scikit-Learn where the distribution is, what's the name of that package, and what random forest classifier is. So I don't know which one is going to win. I'm betting random forest.
Are we allowed to use all the data now, or just us? Are we allowed to use all the data, or we just have to use 1,000 samples still?
Oh, we should use 1,000, yeah, because the data is too big. Oh, it's not that big. Let's use 79,000. Let's see.
Okay. Might have an effect on which model.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. The reason that I use capital X is because it's a matrix. That's the kind of the reason that I do it. There is no programmatic reason. So to me, it represents a matrix where I have the elements, and then Y is a vector. So it's not a matrix. So vectors generally are represented as lowercase. All right, so let's do the final breakout room of the morning session, although I know that for some of you it's not morning at all. I'm gonna recreate, and then I'm gonna do 14 minutes.